So we're back on the road again, and we're at the book of Ezra. Before we jump in there, I did want to just comment, because I've been asked 3 or 4 different times, actually from my son calling me and other things, how does this affect biblical prophecy? I'm going to give a caution first, because it's very dangerous to start applying dates, obviously, which we should never do, even interpreting events before they're fully rolled out. But I'll say a couple things. You have to remember, in the Bible, Ezekiel 38-39 give us the coalition of the Gog-Magog war. And Persia is explicitly mentioned in that. So is Iran going to turn Western and like in the 70s, it was with the Shah? No, I don't think so. The Bible, if the time that we're living in is where I think we are, Iran is not going to convert and become a Western civilization. They're not going to have a free democracy, and it's just not going to happen. And if it did, it would be a false one, because they're mentioned in that coalition of Russia, Turkey, and Iran, Yemen, Sudan, and some other Kastans is in there in Eastern Europe. They're all mentioned in the Bible, and they're going to come against Israel, and only God is going to save Israel. Israel's not going to have the capability, and no other nations are going to come to their rescue either. So something has to happen to the United States, and Iran's still going to be involved there. With that said, one of the dilemmas of the battle of Gog and Magog has always been it can't start until there's peace. Israel has to feel like they're at peace and they're in an unwalled village, and that they don't expect it. Okay, so that's one. Well, we know that last week, last month, last year, Israel's never felt that way. I mean, they got bomb shelters for everybody. Sirens go off every week for them to go because they're getting bombed all the time. So they have not been in a condition where Ezekiel 38 and 39 could occur. And other than the rapture, because that's imminent, that could happen right now, today, Ezekiel 38 and 39 is the next thing that is going to possibly happen on the prophetic clock. So that's why it's so important. But it's impossible for Ezekiel 38 and 39 to happen right now, or in the past, and even right now, to be honest with you, because they're not living at peace. They're at war right now. So if the outcome of this war, yet to be known, is that the head of the snake, which Iran is the funding of most of the terrorist groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, all these terrorist organizations get funding from Iran, the head of the snake. So if it gets chopped off here and neuters them, then that's going to set up a stage for peace to occur in the Middle East. And if the Abrahamic Accords, which have been bubbling slowly along, all of a sudden get this surge of energy and start signing actual, peace agreements, it could be very easy to see a year from today or so that there is these peace agreements on all Israel's neighbors, and then Israel will go, finally, what we've been looking for forever. We don't have these terrorist organizations funded anymore. We've pretty much taken care of them since what month was it now? I always forget. No, it was September 7th.
Oh, yeah.
The war. Huh?
Oh, yeah.
The 7th?
October.
Thank you. October 7th. And so if all of that has occurred, and these peace agreements, you could see how the setting up of the Ezekiel 38, 39 war is there. But I caution people, and you're going to have people trying to set dates and timing. We know the season, and we're in it, but we don't know dates. So just stay away from them.
I always thought things have to get a lot worse than they are right now, like worldwide.
But they actually got to get better, because they got to live at peace in the Middle East, and this could set that stage. So they're going to get. I mean, that's all fake peace. All of that's fake, But it's a pseudo peace. But as long as Israel feels protected, that sets the stage. So that's where this fits biblically. Other than that, there's no mention of this particular war in the Bible. Nothing like that. All we're still looking through a telescope at a distance, and then the closer we get, the more pieces fall into place, the more we understand telescoping it. Anyway, so I wanted to mention that because of the seriousness of what happened yesterday. So we should be praying for the peace of Jerusalem. We're commanded in the Bible to pray for them. and just peace for her nation and all that. So,
And just for our soldiers, we've lost 3 so far.
is that the number? I hadn't heard that.
5 are seriously injured, and then 3 have been lost.
Yeah, this is a tough one that we weren't going to get out of probably unscathed because of the enormity of what was done. So anyway, so I wanted to talk that. A little bit of other things. I mean, obviously the war was started on the Sabbath, Shabbat, which is very unusual for Israel to do that, but they did it. They started it on Shabbat. It was during...
actually 9/11 on the Muslim calendar.
Was it?
It's 9/11, 1447, or whatever their year is. But it was their 9/11.
Oh.
I think that's why Trump chose it.
Chose it. Well, and I know they did a last minute change in their strategy, but they also did it during Ramadan, which is the holy
On the
day.
Ramadan calendar.
Yep, on the Ramadan calendar. Yeah, and so that gets us into here. There's a lot going on here, and when I was preparing to teach this lesson, I was thinking, I'm going to work in the celebration of Purim, which is in a perfect world, I would have timed it so we were studying Esther, which is 2 books away, during Purim, which starts tomorrow at sunset, goes from tomorrow at sunset to Tuesday at sunset. It would have been a perfect fit if we would have done Esther today, but we didn't.
When all this started, I was out and about, so I didn't even hear it happen until I got home. And, Scott was filling me in, and of course I started watching the TV and all that. And I start, when you get on Facebook and you start looking around, there's more than ever amount of incorrect information.
Yes.
And I don't, if you all know who Jack Hibbs is, he's a Calvary Chapel pastor. Yeah. He is extremely involved, and he does live broadcast on Facebook all the time. And if you want truth of what's going on, pull him up.
So be always and never more than, like Kim said, than today. Be cautious what you trust on the internet. I said it once here before. I used to have an old saying. I'd say, remember what Abraham Lincoln said, never trust what you read on the internet, and of course.
And Reagan was trust but verify. Isn't he the one that said that?
Yeah.
Is it the same as what my grandmother taught me, is on material, always measure twice before you cut?
That's a good rule. That's a good rule. And I think on the internet, always be cautious.
And so some people brought up the point that maybe since we have poked the Iranian bear, that they might send a signal over here for their little cell groups to do some damage. So you got to pray about that too.
Yeah,
I'm not worried about it.
Yeah, we're not done with this yet, for sure. Yeah. The smoke hasn't even settled, let alone the retaliation plans and all that. I think biblically, though, we'll know more in months to come. I think next year, not even next year, the end of this year, how it pans out will tell us a lot. So we'll see. So back to the book of Esther here. So we're studying the book of Esther. You got to remember.
Ezra.
I'm sorry, Ezra. And I'm going to.
Because you were talking about it earlier.
Yeah. I was talking about Ezra.
We'll assume you mean Ezra when you say
Thank
Esther.
you. Yes, there you go. Just replace anytime I say Esther with Ezra. Ezra is a priest, Esther's a queen. So, anyway.
Wait a minute.
Do not get the two confused.
Do not get it confused. There's no identity thing here. I identify as. So, anyway. So, you got to remember where we left off with 2 Chronicles. There's so much here, guys, and I'm thinking, how am I going to do this in a day? But I'm going to do it in a day. So, we had the destruction of the temple in 586. That's where we left off with Chronicles. Ezra, I was going to say Esther. Ezra is 70 years later, and we're going to see that. I'm going to tie into some of this stuff. The one word that I picked for this book is restoration. It's restoration of the temple. It's restoration of the Word of God. It's restoration of the covenant, and it's restoration of the wall around the city of Jerusalem, and restoration of Jerusalem. All of that is going to occur in Ezra and Nehemiah. We came out of the books where 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And I said that's the last books that are 1st and 2nd. And it is. But Ezra and Nehemiah are hyphenated. They go together. In the Tanakh, in the Old Testament Tanakh, it's called Ezra hyphen Nehemiah, and they're always taught together because they really tell the same story. In fact, Ezra goes in chapter 4, and he actually talks about, he jumps forward, which we'll talk about when we get to chapter 4, forward into Nehemiah's workings. I say traditionally by Ezra because, like some of the New Testament, when Paul says, I, Paul, a servant of the Lord, we know Paul wrote it because he's claiming in the very, very beginning. The book of Ezra and a lot of the Old Testament don't actually come out and explicitly say, I, Ezra. But in the book of Ezra, we're going to find places where he's talking first person. So he's talking about himself and what he's doing. So it's obvious that he wrote the book. There's only 10 chapters. So you'd have thought, well, you can get your 10 chapters. I mean, Genesis was 50. Isaiah is going to be 66. Wait till we get to that one. This is only 10 chapters, but they're full of stuff. It's just full of stuff, so it's hard. It's the only other book that's written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. And the reason Ezra is written in Hebrew and Aramaic, of course, he's Hebrew, so he's written in Hebrew. But when he gets decrees from the kings of Persia, speaking of Iran, Persia, with this whole study is going to be about Cyrus, Persian king, Iranian king nowadays. We got Darius, Persian king. You got Azursky, Persian king, Artaxerxes. These 4 kings are all going to play. They're all from Persia. They're all from Iran. So it's very appropriate. But he wrote it because when he gets these decrees, and he gets them from Cyrus, from Darius, and from Artaxerxes, there's 3 decrees that come. They come in Aramaic. So he writes them in Aramaic. Probably just an exact quote of the decree. I have had a lot of people, not a lot of people, I'm sorry. I have saw on the internet where this one guy was claiming that the Quran, which was written much later, 300-400s, and it's written in Arabic, was more relatable to the Old Testament than the Christian faith because it's written in Greek, right? Which is first just crazy because that has nothing to do with the language. But Aramaic is not Arabic. So some people will say, oh, well, the Bible's written in Arabic, which is what the Muslims speak. That's not true. Aramaic is a different language. Arabic is a different language. Hebrew. So there's what we call Semitic languages. And Akkadian is the first. This, I wanted to get in this, but I'm not going to be able to get too far in this. But you have Akkadian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. They're all Semitic languages, and there's some others, but the 3 top ones is Akkadian, Hebrew, and Aramaic. Those are the 3
So
fathers.
we have Latin as our base, and they have a
exactly.
Did you say that
Akkadian.
Akkadian is
It's actually Semitic. Now, Akkadian is the oldest Semitic language that archaeologists have found written. So they say that was the first language, but Akkadian is dated back to I think 1000 BC. Well, we know 1000 BC. You have David. David in 1010 BC was king. We know Saul, David, Moses. They all spoke Hebrew. So just because we don't have any archaeological proof, because I think we have the first archaeologist.
archaeological.
Thank you. Proof of Hebrew language, which is a Semitic language, is in 1200 BC. So well after Saul, David, and Solomon, where they were all speaking in it and writing in it, but we don't have proof of it. So historians say it did not exist proof-wise until 1200 BC. Because they don't believe the Bible. They don't take Bible as validity. But we clearly know it existed hundreds and hundreds of years before that. We don't know what language Adam spoke. We don't know necessarily what language Noah spoke. We know Adam, Noah, he had 3 sons. You have Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They populated the world to the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel occurred, and all the languages were separated then. So everybody spoke the same language. Adam, no, but we don't know what it is. It's been lost. Mm-hmm. Some people theorize that it was Hebrew, but we don't know that. So anyway, so just understand there's this thing about the languages and when they all occur, and if you take the Bible, we can definitely take it back to probably Moses. Moses probably spoke Hebrew. But Abraham was the first Hebrew. Hebrews didn't even exist before Abraham. He was the first Hebrew person when he came out of Ur. Anyway. We learned all that in Genesis, or alluded to all of that in Genesis. The time period is under King. It's nice because the very first verse in Ezra says, King Cyrus, or Cyrus, king of Persia, and historians know that Cyrus conquered Babylon in 538 BC. So we knew the exact date that Ezra starts writing this, and he's going to write to us over a time period of 80 years. So he's writing after the fact. He's not prophesying. He's not a prophet. He's writing historical things of what he has occurred. And he's writing what he did during this period to encourage the people coming back. This is like the second great Exodus. We had the great Exodus when Joseph saved the nation of Israel, and then Moses goes down there and they have this great Exodus. Well, the first great Exodus with Moses was millions of people coming out of Egypt. We only have thousands of people, tens of thousands, but thousands, not millions, because not everybody comes. And we'll talk about that a little too. But it is like an Exodus because they went into captivity for 70 years. Judah at the time was wiped out. The nation of Israel was wiped out, with the 10 tribes in the north into Assyria. Babylon conquers Syria, and then also Judah. So they're all taken off to Babylon. So now all of them are kind of mingled in with the Babylonian culture. And they're there for 70 years. This theme of this book is Ezra's a priest. He's a scribe and a priest. And he's trying to encourage the people to return. So that's the whole theme of this book. I wanted to show you this because we are jumping forward. You've seen this before. So we've got our 17 history books, starting with the 5 and the law, and then the rest of the history books which ends with Esther. And then we have 17 prophetic books. Now we have the 5 wisdom books or poetry books, but then we have 17 prophetic books. These are all prophets. And the reason I want to point this out is because these last 3 books we're going to cover, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, are somewhat in chronological order. So we've been going in chronological order to the whole Bible. But what we're going to do here all of a sudden is these last 3 books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, leap us forward, and they're called, post-exile books. So they're books written after the 70-year captivity. Down here, now when we're done with this, after we finish the 5 poetic books or wisdom books, we're going to start back on these prophetic books, and we're going to jump back again during the times of the Kings and the Chronicles. So all of these prophets prophesied during the Kings and the Chronicles, during that time period that we have been talking about for the last 3 weeks or so, 4, 5, 6 weeks. So we're going forward. And the reason I'm saying that, these 3 books are going forward 70 years. So we're out of chronological order now. And we will back up later. But also the last 3 prophetic books and the 3 minor prophets there, Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, they also prophesied during the Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther time frame. So we have the last 3 history books, and the last 3 prophetic books are all about the post-exile period. All these other ones are pre-exile and during the exile. I have a chart here that'll help us visualize that. I like pictures, I like visualization. So what we have here is we have before the exile itself, and after the exile. And remember, we're going to do after the exile right now. Ezra is after exile. So these are the ones that kind of tell you, it's a good picture. You'll have them when I send them out after class. You'll have the prophets that prophesied to the nation of Judah, the ones that prophesied to the nation of Israel. We have Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, and then Edom, which is the descendants of Esau, and they come into play too. And there's prophets against him, Obadiah. So right now, like I said, we're going to be over after the post-exile period. And I wish this chart actually showed the 3 history books too. I wish it showed Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, because they fall same period there. But this is just focusing on prophets, not. And remember, these prophets you're looking at here are just the 17 prophets that have a book named after them. Remember when we were going through Kings, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles had other, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha. There were other prophets inside those, but they don't have a book. They're inside the books of Kings and Chronicles. These all have a book named after them, and that's why they're addressed separately. I kind of did it here too. I'm going to just send this out. We're not going to cover it. A very similar thing, but this one actually has dates up there for us. It has the world empires that were in control during this period too, because sometimes we just focus on Judah, right, and how the countries around them affect them. And that's when we bring in Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and stuff. So they give you the time periods and all that. And did these also have? Yeah, there it is. Esther, and I brought this into Esther.
Ezra.
Thank you. Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. They're down there. So this shows it all. I wanted to show this one first because it's simpler. Once you get this solidified in your head, it's simpler. And then you come to here, it's a little busier. So I didn't want to start out with this one, but I'm going to send it. You can have it for your own, historical references when you can go look at
We
it.
would have learned this in world history in high school instead of all the garbage that we,
True.
and
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the Mayans, because all that stuff was going on during
Aztecs,
this time
Mayans,
too. And
all
it'd
of
be
that stuff.
Good to have that as a perspective instead of all these
Yep. I agree 100%.
secular.
Yeah. Well, you can work in the secular stuff too, right? But yeah, we should have definitely,
I mean, Mayans are definitely
because
secular, but
yeah. I suppose the kids, and I have no idea because I didn't go to a religious school, but I wonder if the Bible colleges taught this. I don't know. So the book is broken up into basically two sections we can kind of cover. Chapters 1 through 6 is going to focus on Zerubbabel. I said that Ezra and Nehemiah are hyphenated. You have the book of, and there are two books in the Protestant Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah. I think we should have three. Zerubbabel, and it would have been short books, but Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, because that's really, Zerubbabel is a main focus. In fact, it's over half the book. Ezra's writing about this history, and Zerubbabel takes up over half of his book, chapters 1 through 6. And then Ezra himself comes into play in chapter 7 and finishes out 7 through 10. So it's kind of broken up that way. I'm going to show you, once again, I like pictures. So I didn't know how to teach this, so I was thinking to myself, I'm going to give very high level picture of everything. And if we have time, I have some slides. I have 10 slides to slow down and look at chapters 1 through 10. Whether we get to that or not, we'll see. But you will get the whole book in this overview. You will get everything, all the chapters in this overview. So this overview kind of tells us, like I said, I wish it was hyphenated. Zerubbabel is a large portion of Ezra. Then you have Ezra. And then the reason we have Nehemiah in this, not only is that the next book we were going to go into, but Ezra in chapter 4 takes his history all the way to the end and tells the story of Nehemiah also. So he kind of steals a little of Nehemiah's thunder, even though he writes that too in the second book. Because he alludes to it all the way in history. So he takes us all the way in chapter 4 of the book of Ezra. The major theme of the book is the return and restoration of all these things I said, the temple, the word of God and the worshiping, and then the wall and Jerusalem. That's the main theme. But the second overarching theme is there was, what's the word I want to use? Opposition, because it uses it here. There is major opposition in Ezra and Nehemiah in every single stage of their effort. It does not go unopposed. And as you can see, so we're going to start it out in chapter 1, verse 1. It says, Cyrus, king of Persia, gives a decree. He gives a decree, permission, saying, so remember, he conquers Babylon. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that happening in one day, and it was prophesied and all that. But I want to get you the forest for the trees, right? I want to show you the forest, because if we get down into the trees, you won't be able to see where the trees are planted in this forest. So this is the forest. So Zerubbabel's the first group to return. They return in 3 phases. And interesting enough, when Babylon conquered Israel, which was it started in 606 BC, I think, 605 or 606 BC, they did it in 3 phases. Nebuchadnezzar came and conquered Israel in 3 phases. The first phase was Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was carried off, and then he placed the next king, which was in the lineage of David, but he puts the next king and says, follow the Persian order, or follow the Babylonian orders, or else. And he does. And then they quit. And so there's a second phase by Babylon. They take off another group of them. And Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, is in that second phase. And of course, the third phase that we know about, we left off at 2 Chronicles. The end of it is in 586, when Babylon got fed up. Nebuchadnezzar came down and he completely destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, 586. So it's destroyed, right? So it was in 3 phases. Now the return back comes in 3 phases too. Phase number 1 is under Zerubbabel. Phase number 2 is under Ezra, and then phase number 3 is going to be under Nehemiah. So it's a 3-phase return, just like it was a 3-phase conquer or exodus. The first phase here, Zerubbabel starts out great. He builds an altar. That's the first thing he does. Is he builds an altar and sacrifices to God. I love the way it starts out. And then he builds the foundation of the temple. But then this opposition starts occurring, and what happens is they actually send, they come, and we'll see it, they want to help at first, because they're Samaritans. So who are Samaritans? Samaritans are the people up the north that were conquered in the 10 tribes of Israel when they were conquered by Assyria. Assyria, how they conquered people is they took the majority, the masses out of there, and then put another nation's people in there to intermix, so there's no nationality. There's no national pride. So they became intermixed. The 10 tribes of the north became intermixed and became known as Samaritans. That's where Jesus says the good Samaritans. The Jews hated the Samaritans. Why? Because they were a mixture of the 10 tribes of Israel and Assyria, or whoever Syria put in there. So you got them, and they're living there now because Babylon left them there when they conquered them and took Judah out. So they filtered through all of the land of Judah, and now it's their land. It has been for 70 years. That's a whole generation or more of people living in their land. And so first they come in and they say, we sacrifice to the same God you do, but they really didn't, right? They sacrificed to all types of gods, and that was just one of them. In the returning of Zerubbabel and the leaders, they said, no way. We're not having anything to do with you guys, you know. So that ticks them off. So they start plotting against how to stop this. And they send letters up there. By this time, Cyrus has died. Darius is the king of Persia now. And they send him, and he stops the work. So he does stop the work. And there's a pause in the building of the temple for 16 years. So they started it out, and then 16 years later, they make a plea. And, well, first of all, what happens is Haggai and Zechariah, the 2 prophets, God puts it on the heart of Haggai and Zechariah. He lifts them up to go to them and to say, what's going on here, guys? Why'd you stop in the temple? And they were, because the temple work was stopped, what did? They started working in their own homes. So because they were given the land back by Cyrus, so they started building their own homes. And by the time Haggai and Zechariah get there, they said, why are you guys building yourself homes when God still doesn't have a place to live? And he sparks a little revival. And so they send, no, that's later. Okay, yeah. So they start to work again. So 16 years later, they're starting the work on the temple again by the encouragement of the 2 prophets, Zechariah and Haggai. So that happens. Then all of a sudden, we move on. That's chapter 6. They finish in chapter 6, and we'll kind of go to this when I'm going chapter by chapter, I hope. In chapter 6, they finish the temple. So the temple is built. Another pause happens. From the temple completion to Ezra coming on the scene is 58 years. So we had a pause from the altar and the foundation of 16 years before they started working on it again, and then they completed it in chapter 6. And then after chapter 6, between chapter 6 and chapter 7, you have 58 years. And Ezra is wave 2, 58 years later. We have a temple, but it's not functioning. The people have kind of went astray. No one is following the law. So Ezra comes 58 years later, and now notice he's under Artaxerxes. So we went from Cyrus to Darius. Darius, the temple's completed. Then we go to Xerxes, and we jump right over in Ezra's story, and then we go to Artaxerxes, because Artaxerxes is the one that gives Ezra another decree, another permission, and money and everything to go down there and restart and restart the covenant relationship with God. Purim being tomorrow, in between this 58 years, history's going on, right? Up in Persia, what do we have going on? We have the book of Esther. Remember? The book of Esther occurs in this gap here of 58 years. So it's almost like we should teach Zerubbabel and then stop in the middle of chapter 6 of Ezra, and then we should teach Esther, and then we should go back to Ezra.
I'm sure you got those two straight.
I know exactly. Then we should go back to Ezra, and then teach it, and then Nehemiah. So if you wanted to stay in that chronological order, but we're going to do it in the order the books are laid out. So just understand that's what's going to occur there. Is Esther occurs in that 58-year gap. So Ezra comes, he has a revival. He starts planning everything, and he assigns, and we'll get into more detail because he doesn't have enough Levites there to run the temple, and so he has to do it twice. And then we go to the book of Nehemiah. Like I said, the reason this is here in this order is big picture, but it's also because Ezra forces us to kind of in chapter 4, because he takes us all the way through this whole thing in chapter 4. He describes all of this. So yeah.
So when they stopped building,
The temple?
I always thought it was just because they just wanted to build their own houses first. I didn't realize that they were commanded by Darius.
So interesting.
Stop. So they had kind of a, but then they got kind of lazy and it's like, nah,
They did.
just-
So it's funny because when you're studying the book of Ezra, he focuses on they stopped because the opposition forced them to stop. But when you study Haggai and Zechariah, the two prophets, they say, why are you guys working on your own stuff?
That's
So
what
they
I
bring,
remember.
So if you're studying down
So
here
they
with
chose
Haggai,
to
you're
build
going
their
to,
own house instead of building God's house.
you have to put the whole picture of why they stopped by studying Ezra and then also Nehemiah and Zechariah. So, or not Nehemiah, Haggai and Zechariah. Okay. I just have this chart here. These are some of the major players that we're going to be looking at. We've just talked about a number of them, so I'm going to help us. What I've done for you here, we're not, because of time, I want to go faster. I have put a slide together for all these major players, or at least Zerubbabel. I've given you some detail about who Zerubbabel is. He is one of the important things that we need to know about him is chapter 2. So chapter 1 is all about coming back. Chapter 2 is all about genealogy. All of chapter 2. Once again, the Bible's famous to make Scott Henry have to pronounce names, which he doesn't do well. Chapter 2 has all these names of their descendants tracing the genealogy to show us that Zerubbabel is from the lineage of David, for the Davidical kingdom, right? So Zerubbabel, but he can't be a king. Hezekiah was the last king, right? And Babylon's not going to let another king come about. But Zerubbabel is from the lineage of David, but he's a governor. He's more like, for lack of a better word, he's the governor of Judea now, under the Persian king right now. So anyway, so that's who he is. Then we have Ezra himself. Ezra was a scribe and a priest, and he knew the word of God very, very well. And he is the leader of the second wave. Zerubbabel was the leader of the first wave that came for the temple. Ezra is the leader of the second wave, and he brings back the focus on the covenant with God. He reestablishes the covenant with God. He also traces his lineage. He's a priest, and he traces it all the way back to Nathan and Aaron, what am I saying, Nathan? Aaron, Moses' brother, who started the Levitical priesthood. He can trace his back. Zerubbabel, because it's 58 years later, the high priest during Zerubbabel was Joshua, was a priest, the high priest named Joshua. Because he had a priest as well, because remember, he was making a sacrifice on the altar, and Zerubbabel would not qualify to do that. Kings do not make sacrifices, priests do. So the high priest of his day was Joshua. And then 58 years later, Ezra comes to reestablish the covenant, and he is eligible to be a priest and do the sacrifices, because he also, in chapter 2, follows his lineage all the way back there as well. And Nehemiah, of course, is the book we'll study next week, and he is a leader as well. So he's a layperson, though. He doesn't know Davidical or priest. He's a layperson. So I put those in there. Wow, that's the introduction. We are at Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. And normally I would start diving into it, but there's so much other filler I have to give you, even though we just did a high-level overview of this. So in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. I would not do good to not show you the next verse here, or the next slide here. Isaiah. Isaiah says in Isaiah 44:28, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and I will accomplish all that all I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundation be laid. I'm sorry, my wife's shaking her head because I chopped that up. But anyway, you guys are reading it too. The reason this is impressive and important is Isaiah was written 150 years before Cyrus was born. Isaiah names King Cyrus by name 150 years before Cyrus was born, let alone before this happened. And what's that going to cause? That's going to cause a lot of skepticism, right? So I love this. If you read history in the world, historians balked at this. Obviously, they're not going to believe this. How would Isaiah know Cyrus by name? So they were putting all these dates on the book of Isaiah. They said multiple people wrote it, and it occurred much. It was written. This portion of it was written after the fact, and much later. In fact, they put dates on it like 100 BC. 150 BC. They were putting all these weird dates on this. But guess what happened in 1947? We found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have the whole book of Isaiah in there. And those date back to 250 BC. So all those PhDs and all those historians that were putting dates of 100 and even some in the AD, got egg all over their face, because we found the whole book of Isaiah in 1947 in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and those dated back to 250. Isaiah dated back to 250 BC. Now, to be fair, 250 BC is still after this occurred. So it doesn't get, now all those people that were putting those real later dates on it just readjusted their theory and put dates prior to 250 BC and still after Cyrus, after Cyrus was king. So, but I just love the fact that they got egg on their face because of the dates they were setting. They should be cautious when they're setting dates that contradict the Bible, and they're not. They're just in the whim they do it.
And you said 150 years before he was even born.
150 years before Cyrus was born, Isaiah was written. That's that's the conservative theologians' belief. Obviously, historians would say it was written by multiple authors over a long period of time, and the last half of it was written after this, 400.
If they just believed the Bible for what it says, like we talked about last week, they wouldn't have gotten egg on their face.
True.
I mean,
so that gets us back to Cyrus here. So in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, he ordered to fulfill the word of God. So I wanted to show you this too. So I wouldn't do justice once like Isaiah prophesied 150 years ago about Cyrus, Jeremiah also prophesied about the destruction and Cyrus conquering it. Why is this important? And I was thinking, how do I want to work this all in? So we have Chronicles. Remember when we left Chronicles? Well, first, before I even started, we're studying Ezra, and we left off Second Chronicles, and Second Chronicles stopped abruptly. We have the destruction of the temple in 586 BC, and that was chapters 35, 36, and all the verses all the way up to verses 22 and 23. So verses 1 through 21 was still talking about 586 and the destruction of the temple. And the last two verses of Chronicles, which Ezra wrote, he puts in the statements about Cyrus, king of Persia. So the last two verses of Chronicles are the exact same as the first two verses of Ezra. And Ezra starts, and this was 48 years later, right? So 48 years in 1986 is when Ezra starts writing his. So he picks up, again, and he's writing the same thing. So Ezra starts there. But also, we have Daniel. So I kind of wanted to, and I know I had so much in the overview, but I wanted to bring us up from where we left off when we studied Chronicles. So we have the destruction in 586, but then we have Daniel. So remember the chart I showed you where you had the pre-exile, the exile, and the post-exile. Daniel was one of the ones that prophesied during the exile, and him and Jeremiah. And so Daniel is prophesying, and he's reading Jeremiah. Jeremiah prophesies that before it happened, you're going to go into captivity, and you're going to go into captivity for 7 years or 70 years. And we learn this, that God is punishing them and allowed Nebuchadnezzar to conquer them in 586 because they had not honored the yearly Sabbaths. Every 7 years, supposed to let the land rest. And they did not do that. And it took 70 years to make up all the Sabbath rests, the land Sabbaths, that they did not honor. So God says, I'm going to let the land take its rest all at once. I'm going to remove you from the land because of your sin, and I'm going to let the land rest for 70 years. And Jeremiah is telling this background, and then Daniel is in exile. Remember, he was the first wave, and he's reading Jeremiah, and he goes, wow, we're getting to the end of the 70 years. We're almost at the end of this. God's going to bring us back to the land. So he lets us know through the reading of Jeremiah that that Babylon's going to be conquered. And then, interesting enough, towards the end of Daniel's lifetime, we have Nebuchadnezzar had died. Belshazzar, which is his his son, is now king of Babylon. And remember, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Israel, they took all the gold and all the cups and utensils and all that stuff out of the temple, and they put it in the Babylonian treasury. Nebuchadnezzar was, and I think he actually was converted in the end of his life, but anyway, he was honorable of all that. He conquered them, yes, but he was honorable of how he treated them and the utensils. His son, Belshazzar, was having a party, got a little drunk, and he orders his officials, go to our treasury and get all the gold, cups and everything, and let us party with them. That's Scott paraphrasing this, but that's what it says. And so when he starts to do that, remember, those have been sanctified, made holy for God's use only. That's what sanctification means, is to be set aside for God's use. Those utensils were not supposed to use for anything but serving the Lord in the temple. So when he used them, all of a sudden, we've had a couple pictures here where God gives us the ability to open our eyes, mankind's eyes, and see into the other dimension. Remember, I've said, I believe, this is Scott, but I think it's true, we live in a space-time continuum, this three-dimensional physical world that we live in, but there's a spiritual realm that's above us. Paul talks about it. We see it throughout the Old Testament. This is another picture where God opens up their eyes, they're all partying, and a hand from this other dimension, from this spiritual dimension, comes through it. It doesn't tell us whether it's God's hand. It doesn't say it's God's hand. It doesn't say it's an angel's hand. It's a hand that comes from the spiritual realm and writes on the wall. Many telek parson, and they don't know what it means. Now it's in a known language, but they don't know what it means because it just is 4 words or 3 words. So it's saying that all their wise people don't know what it means. So Belshazzar calls Daniel, who's still alive, and Daniel comes and interprets this, and it means God has numbered your days on your reign as it brought it to an end, and then you have been weighed and the scales have been found wanting, and your kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. That's Daniel's interpretation of what those words mean. And that very night, the Medes and the Persians went through the water system of Babylon and conquered and killed them all, and conquered in one night. Persia conquered Babylon and took it over. And Daniel because then this is a great story. We'll get to it when we get to Daniel, about him trying to give Daniel money and all that, and he doesn't do it. I put as much of there as would fit. So see, this is why it's hard. And I said this before, the busy chart I showed you with all this stuff, it's so hard because there's elements that fill in the gap of all these prophets that I want to come and teach during the time period that we're talking about. And I couldn't leave Isaiah out, or Jeremiah, or Daniel, at least the element of what led up to Persia taking over Babylon. I hope I didn't confuse things. I hope that made it kind of, okay, good.
That's great.
I gave you this chart, kind of gives the same picture. We have the kingdom of Judah, then we have the Babylonian captivity that would last us for 70 years, and then we're over to the far right there with the rebuilding. The decree comes from Cyrus. So I'm going to give you this chart once again. It shows you Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, which we just talked about and all that, and the Daniel, Ezekiel. We would have to pull all these truths into this story to get a complete picture of everything that's going on here. Jumps back over here to Ezra, Jeremiah. I just, because I mentioned what I mentioned, I wanted to give the scripture to show you I wasn't just saying that. There's actual scripture. This is what Daniel was probably reading, that in Jeremiah 25, Daniel was reading this, that realized, hey, we're at the end of the 70 years. And when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. So they have allowed the land to rest for the 70 missing land Sabbaths, and now they're coming back to there. I wanted to show you this too. So we just went over Jeremiah. We didn't camp long, but it's all about 70 years, right? And I wanted to kind of show you the dates. Remember in 606, remember Babylon conquered Judah, and it was 3 phases. The first phase was in 606 BC. That's when Daniel went. So the very first conquering of people being removed was in 606. I got these color coded for us for easy understanding. The very first returning people to the land was in 536 BC under Zerubbabel when they returned back. That's 70 years. So God fulfills, this is important, God fulfills Jeremiah's prophecy that you're going to be in exile for 70 years in 2 ways. The first exiled people is 70 years later, the first people returning. What does Zerubbabel return to do? To build the temple. In the green, I show you Nebuchadnezzar in the 3rd phase destroys the temple in 586. 70 years later, 516, Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple. So the people group were gone. The first people that were gone were 3 phases, and the first people returning was in 3 phases. The first phase are 70 years of people returning.
That's when they started building it, not when it was done.
So the difference is, look at this as people being thrown into exile and the temple being destroyed. Babylon did 3 phases of destruction on Jerusalem. The first people was in 606, and then 586 was the temple destroyed. So there's a separation there. I didn't do the math, whatever the separation is of 606, those 3 phases took. But the important thing is the people group match with the people group's return. They were exiled in 3 phases. They were brought back in 3 phases. The first people were taken out in 606. The first people brought back were in 536. Zerubbabel was among that first phase. Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah were 3 phases to return. But the temple too. The temple wasn't destroyed until they finally got fed up with Judah in 586. But it's so God, right, to match the 70-year prophecy of Jeremiah to the exiled people and the return of the exiled people and the destruction of the temple and the rebuilding completion of the temple. 516 was the completion when Zerubbabel completed the temple. So it's just cool. I mean, it's a God thing, right? How could mankind have made all these arrangements to be able to do this? It's such a cool thing. Okay, Ezra chapter 1. What is? Okay, so yeah, this gets me into, hopefully, I've got 10 charts left with 10 chapters. And this is high level stuff. We're not going to go into as deep as I'd want to go into each one of these chapters. We would never have finished it because there was so much background that set the stage for us to cover the book of Esther. So Ezra, we know that the important thing here is God stirred the heart of a king of Persia, Cyrus, and he gives the command, and Zerubbabel takes that, and Zerubbabel comes as the first to come down there. I said chapter 2 is all about genealogy. It's just names after names after names to solidify that Zerubbabel had the Davidical line, Joshua was the high priest, and Ezra was eventually the priest 58 years later. All of this is listed, and you could study this, through the genealogy of chapter 2. Chapter 3 is when Zerubbabel actually builds the altar. He builds an altar, which like I said, I love the fact that the first thing he wanted to do was on his heart was to build a sacrifice to God. He builds it and sacrifice to God, and then they started working on the foundation. They built the foundation, and this is, of course, when after they build the foundation, the 16-year pause comes in after this. But it's interesting that in chapter 3, it really describes the rejoicing. So it's 70 years later. Some of these people that are returned have never seen the temple, right? They were kids or born, 70 years ago. So they're rejoicing because they finally get to start sacrificing to their God again, and they get the temple. But the older ones who remember and saw Solomon's temple weep. So there's this weeping and rejoicing that's going on at the same time, because this is nothing. If you remember back to us looking at Chronicles, the gold, the majesty, the glory of the temple was magnificent, right? This is not that. This is the foundation and an altar. It is not that at all. So then we get to 4. 4, we could camp here. I would teach on 4 this whole hour, but we're not going to be able to do that, right? But 4 is where I tried to cover in the overview some of the stuff that happens. Zerubbabel comes first, and it shows that there's a 16-year gap in here. And this is where Ezra in chapter 4 isn't talking chronological anymore. Now the focus in chapter 4 is the opposition. And all chapter 4 is written about the opposition that different peoples were doing. And he starts with Zerubbabel, and then he goes into the opposition that he ran into during his coming back of bringing the law. And he goes all the way forward to Nehemiah's book, where he talks about the opposition that Nehemiah ran into as well. And there's a parentheses, as you can see there. Chapters 1 through 5 is the earlier time period, and then as he starts talking, he jumps 58 years ahead. Do I have 50? Does it say 58? I think it was 58. So 16 years, and then the 58 years ahead on 6 through 23. It goes all the way to Nehemiah, which is 58 years ahead. So a lot of things going on. You should read, when you read chapter 4, if you don't watch it, your mind is chronological, so you're just reading and thinking, this is weird, because you're not realizing the leap in chapter 6 where he does 58-year leap there. So you got to read it careful. And how do you find out what he's talking about? He doesn't say, now 58 years later. He's using kings. So when he says Cyrus, he's talking about Cyrus's time period. When he talks about Darius, he's talking about Darius's time period. And then he jumps all the way to Artaxerxes. We know historically he just jumped 58 years because of Artaxerxes. He doesn't tell you that. So if you don't know when these kings reigned, you won't realize he made such a high leap. So if you just read it like a book, it will stump you. So when you read it, 4 needs to be studied, not read. 5, the work resumes after the 16 years. It's because Prophet Haggai and Zechariah, once again, we learn what Ezra says the reasoning is, but we learn better in Haggai and Zechariah why they come. I'm not going to get into Tadaniah. He's the governor, and we could camp on him along too, but he basically questions them and say, why are you building this and all that? And they don't stop this time. Okay, they stopped last time with the opposition, but this time he's pushing back on them, and they don't. And but he does go back to Persia and say, hey, these people are building this temple or wall at this time. Or no, he's bringing it back. He says, why is Ezra there? But they're still building on it. And he says, why are they building? And he goes back to Persia. And in chapter 6, it talks about the cylinder of Cyrus's cylinder. This is something that was found in 1879. And it's not a biblical, but once again, I love it. Historical evidence in the cylinder of Cyrus. It says that Cyrus sent a decree for them to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild it. And Tadaniah is the one that went back, and Cyrus has been dead, right? So he's going back and they're saying, hey, is this true? Did they get permission? And the king says, well, I don't know. Let me research, because he didn't know. I mean, right? It was done by Cyrus. So that's when he finds this cylinder in their records, and he says, yes, he did. And so when he sends word back to Tadaniah, he says, not only do they have permission, but you are to give them tax dollars. Tadaniah was the governor of the larger, Zerubbabel was the governor of Judea, a little area in Jerusalem, but Tadaniah was the governor of the larger Euphrates realm, Trans-Euphrates, I think they call it. And he was just told that you give them the tax dollars to rebuild it. So not only was it confirmed, yes, they're allowed to build it, but you also need to give them tax dollars to do it, which couldn't make them, these people that were opposing it, couldn't make them happy. Not only did they say, stop opposing them, but now you have to give them your tax dollars to help them out as well.
There's no change of heart in Darius. He's just following what.
Exactly. It's Persian. If it's written right in Persia, it's a big deal. And we learned that more in Daniel and the Daniel and the Lion's Den and all that, where if Persia gives a decree, even the king is bound by that decree. They cannot change that.
It just never pays to be a tattletale.
It never pays to be. We'll learn that in Esther too. Yes. So they return, and remember, so Ezra arrives in 458 BC during Artaxerxes. So I showed this once again because we're kind of focusing. We've been talking about Cyrus and under Darius, and all of a sudden we jump way forward into Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes in 458. So you got to pay attention to when these kings reigned. And there's a 58-year gap. Ezra comes back and causes a revival. It causes the people's hearts to change and come back to start following the covenant again. Remember, they're under a contract. They're under a covenant agreement. And they kind of wander. We've seen this through judges, the kings, everywhere. They're under a binding covenant contract, and those contracts are conditional and unconditional, and they fail every time in the conditional portions. Only the unconditional promises of God stand true, because God never fails. But they constantly fail the if-then statements and stuff. So then we have 8. This is a second return. Remember, there's 3 waves here, and Ezra is returning with the second phase here, and they find out they don't have enough Levites. They have a lot of family, descendants and stuff of Jacob, the 12 tribes that are coming home and stuff, but they don't have enough Levites. So it's all about 7 or 8. It's all about him having to go back and get more Levites to run the temple, because they're having a revival. They're starting to sacrifice again. And what's the temple? The temple is a lot of slaughtering, a lot of sacrifice, and a lot of taking care of the temple area and stuff. So he has to go back. And when they're going back with this phase, when he goes back, it's under Artaxerxes, and they're saying how God is the God of the universe and all this. And so they get this dilemma in here that they would normally, because of the danger of making that trip, want armed escorts from Persia, right? Persia controls all the land, but they're thinking it's this whole back and forth saying, well, we don't want to say we don't trust our God. So they fast and pray, and they decide we're not going to go with any protection. We're going to trust God to get us there safely. And of course he does. So that's a big deal in 8 too, about them trusting, because a revival's going on, right? They're in the mindset for 70 years of thinking like the world thinks, and all of a sudden now they got to recondition themselves and start thinking like God wants them to think. And then that's all going on in 8 as well. 7 and 8. 9. We get to this. 9 and 10 are together. 9 and 10 go together. and it's about intermarriage. And this can be a difficult 2 chapters to teach because of how they solve it, but it's really not. And a lot of people use these chapters very incorrectly. These 2 chapters are not being addressed. Ezra is not addressing intermarriage in one nation to another, even though we know the Israel wanted to keep the purity of their nation. We got to remember. I want to show you some examples. I had written them down so I wouldn't forget them. Tamara. We went over the story of Tamara, where Tamara was a Canaanite, and she married one of Judas's son, and that's the whole story where her husband died. So we get into the marriage custom, or kinsman redeemer. And he gave his next son, he dies, and then he had a younger son, he didn't give it, and then she dressed up like a prostitute and tricks Judah, and she has a son, she was right to do that, and Judah took the blame for that. Tamara, anyway, she was a Canaanite. She's in the lineage of Christ. She's in the same lineage of David and Christ. Then we have Rahab. Rahab was a Canaanite in Jericho when the 2 tribes of spies went away. These are conversions of other nations converting to Judaism, marrying into Judaism, and being in the lineage of Jesus Christ. I've often told you guys, just like the church's responsibility, we're not supposed to be inward, we're supposed to take care of our own, but we're supposed to be a light on the hilltop, salt in the earth. Our purpose is to show the love of God to the lost, to draw them to Christ. Nation of Israel was always that way too. They were worse than the church, looking inward. They became nationalist almost. It was never their intent to be nationalist. They were supposed to be a light to the world as well. And they were supposed to draw other nations with their light to Judaism, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we have examples of that. Like I said, Tamara, Rahab. We have Ruth that we're going to be studying in Esther. We're going to realize that. Ruth was a Moabite. And then we have Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, David's wife. She was a Hittite. So we have women purposefully put into the Bible showing the lineage of David and Jesus that aren't Jewish. And God did that on purpose, right? So I say that to say Ezra is scolding them because of the mixed marriages, not because they couldn't have had other people from other nations believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and then take them in marriage. That wasn't the sin. The sin is taking, much like Solomon did in his later years, taking other wives and bringing their gods into Jerusalem. That's what they did. This is them allowing the women that they bring in to worship other gods. And that's the real sin that they're addressing here. But it focuses a lot on intermarriage because they're using that synonymously, that the intermarriage is pagan and other gods. But the real focus of what they're trying to correct is bringing other gods. It's idolatry. They're worshiping other gods. They're breaking the first commandment, the second commandment, and the third commandment. Well, maybe not the third.
So if
but
those women had converted into Judaism,
it would have been okay. Yeah. Every example in the Bible, when another person converts to Judaism, it's okay. Yeah. It was never a problem.
Tamar did, and
Tamara, Rahab, all of them did. Yep. So, but these women hadn't, and it's the problems of the nation. The nation should have made them before you bring them in. So that's kind of what's going on there. And then 10 is the solution to that problem, and the solution is the difficult thing. They all come. Actually, they're told every man needs to be here in 3 days to Jerusalem, from no matter where you're living, or you're going to lose your land. If you don't show up in Jerusalem in 3 days, you will be erased from the lineage, and your land will be confiscated. It will no longer be yours. So everybody showed up to Jerusalem. And then they went through and they all repented, and they had to dispose of their wives. The Bible in chapter 10 says they let the women and children go, but they did it according to the law of Moses. The law of Moses doesn't just let you say, you're gone. You have to support them. You have to give them funding. So they were legally bound by the law to give means for them to sustain life, to live. but they weren't allowed to marry to them anymore. They had to send them away. So if you just say, well, I sent them away, how cruel, they did it according to the law. So they had to follow the law. So it's it's the reason it's a tough chapter 9 and 10 to teach, because so many people have misused it and abused it, taught it wrong. If you understand the purpose of it, and the purpose of it is, it kind of goes into the New Testament where don't be unequally yoked. If you're unequally yoked in marriage or in business or in relationships, what happens is you're partnering. You have a father and they have a father, and your father and their father aren't the same thing. And there's only two fathers, the Father of God and the Father of Satan. So if we're unequally yoked, we're partnering with Satan. Yes?
Yes, could another aspect of that be to let the wives go is the land issue, that if the male died, that they would have an inheritance of the land and they wanted to keep it with the Jewish people?
That is definitely true in all of Israel, because the land stays with the males, which is why it was so important for a female to have a male. Huh?
It would go to the son.
It would go to the son
Who works
of
as
a pagan, exactly. Right. And that's the reason. So the land was given to Israel and his 12 sons, and that land was supposed to be allotted to each one of the 12, and it was supposed to stay inside their families. And if you started diluting the family, like I said, there was nothing wrong. Clearly, David was the tribe of Judah, and he took Bathsheba, a Hittite. So you could take foreign people. The land had to stay under the umbrella of Judaism, of worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It wasn't as much about what nationality you were, it was about what faith you were. Were you of the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And that's the important thing. But you're exactly right. All of that ties to land allotment.
Right.
Because land allotment was supposed to stay under the umbrella of Judaism, the 12 sons of Jacob. So yeah. And I know I'm running out of time. So this is kind of the last, I just did a high level theological themes of what's going on. God's sovereignty, and he directs history, which is important today. God's hand is on what's going on today. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason for a believer to be worried about what's going on in the world today, because God's hand is in control of destiny and history. And it was history. Worship must be central. And we could go on and show this how it's applicable to our lives too. It isn't just important to Israel or the nation of Judah. It's also important to our life. Worship must be the center of our lives. Compromise always weakens, your relationship with God. Leadership does shape. It's important to be under the right leadership, the right church, the right, president, it's important to have right leaders. And repentance restores relationship. Always. The prodigal son's a perfect picture for us. Prodigal son was insane in a pig pen, worst place for a Jewish boy. His sanity came back to him, the Bible says. Immediately he returns to his father, and his father welcomes with an open arm. Repentance always produces immediate acceptance from God. So that's kind of really fast through those 10 chapters.